Okay, so we're live. Hi, I'm Rand Hoppy. I am the executive director of the Jack Kirby Museum. We are in the midst of day 2 of the 3 days for 103, celebrating what would have been Jack Kirby's 103rd birthday. Who am I here with? Who are you guys?
I am the president of the Jack Kirby Museum, and we're here with...
And I'm Charles Hatfield. I'm a person who studies comics.
You are?
And teaches comics.
That is true, yes.
So it's great to have you here, Charles. We've had a wonderful time chatting with you in the past, exploring the exhibit that you mounted at CSUN. How many years ago was that, actually?
The Cal State Northridge Art Gallery's exhibition, Comic Book Apocalypse, was in the fall of 2015. So it's been 5 years now. It was in the works for a few years before that. It's been 5 years since we did it. And I miss it all the time. It was nice to be on campus and to pop in and see drawings and collages by Jack Kirby. That was a rare privilege.
I am going to just take a moment to do the thing that I've been doing, which is saying we are on Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and on Twitter with Periscope. Please feel free to make comments, ask questions, and in those various chats and or comment sections, and they will slurp back to us, and we will be able to see them, and perhaps even respond to them or share them on the screen. So you know, that's what we're all about. We're trying to just have like a Jack Kirby virtual pop-up convention here with all these folks, and we're really glad that Charles was able to join us. So,
I'm glad to be able to join you. Thanks so much for putting this together and keeping the home fires burning for the study of Jack Kirby.
Yeah, man.
So I've been at Cal State Northridge this is my 20th year now. My 20th year, I've been teaching a comics course or courses pretty steadily for 15 years. And I had the good fortune to do that Kirby exhibition, as you mentioned, and I keep on writing and thinking about Kirby. So I'm excited about things that are happening in what I have taken to calling Kirby studies. It sounds a little academic to say that, but hey, it's part of what I do. Kirby
That's
studies.
what it is.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to see it branching out and getting so much further than I was capable of getting when I did the Hand of Fire book that came out, what was it, 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's an exciting, dynamic field, as you know. So are you advancing images, or am I advancing images?
No, I can do it, yes.
Okay. Thank you for acknowledging the passing of Chadwick Boseman, a terrible irony that an actor known for playing one of Kirby's characters should pass on Jack Kirby's birthday yesterday. Real dignity and grace in his performance as T'Challa, as well as his many other historic roles. And this was a person for whom fame or celebrity was never about himself only, even though he was a singular presence. I think he knew what his roles might mean to his fans, and so he was very gracious in that realm, off screen as well as on. I thought he did a splendid job in Ryan Coogler's Black Panther film, and as he's done in a number of historic roles. So just wanted to acknowledge, as I'm sure many people have been doing for the past day, his passing. So unfortunate news. Yeah. So yeah, this is coming out, right? The Eternals film is coming out sometime, and this reminds me that, hopefully. And so we're getting into the deep cuts for Kirby, the things that are not marquee 1960s characters, or Captain America or the like. I never thought I'd see the day, frankly, and who knows what this will be like and how it will be received. But I think it's interesting to see the publicity surrounding these things. It's often publicity that is Jack Kirby centric. So there's a sense in the larger public of Kirby as a creator and a designer and a storyteller beyond just the marquee characters that people would know from the Avengers franchise. So that's an exciting thing to see in Kirby studies, is that there's this larger sense that the public, through things like the Eternals, but also through films like Thor Ragnarok, which is a very Kirby-centric design aesthetic. And the filmmakers are very upfront about that. They want to claim that. They want people to know what their inspirations were. That's pretty cool to see, I think. And it's a sign that the larger public awareness of Kirby is growing, which I am really grateful for. And of course, 20 years ago, we would not have had a book like Tom Scioli's Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics. It was great that you, Tom and Rand, started your conversations yesterday by talking to Tom Scioli about his love of Kirby and his deep knowledge of Kirby. I mean, there's a vogue for graphic biographies and graphic history now. It's a highly sellable genre. But I think Tom Scioli has taken that in a very personal direction. And to see a Kirby-centric story as opposed to a Marvel-centric story or a corporate-centric story coming out in this accessible form, I think that's a watershed. I don't think we would have seen that even a few years ago. So that's another exciting development in the larger, wouldn't you say, the public perception of Kirby?
Without a doubt.
Yeah, so that's cool. I'm also excited about what happens when people start paying attention to Jack Kirby or comics art in general in the fine arts world. And we can definitely look to Dan Nadel as a kind of a pivotal figure here. Back in 2014, I think, at the RISD Museum, he curated this show called What Nerve, which took artistic collectives or groups or scenes like the Harry Who or Destroy All Monsters and juxtaposed their work with the work of particular artists like Gary Panter, who is obviously much influenced by Jack Kirby, and Kirby himself. So you had the kind of cheek by jowl in the same gallery or museum space. You had a Kirby collage, and then you had these other kinds of images. And that's a really cool thing to see. Some others have also put Kirby into some unexpected art world context. So Daniel Duford had his Fighting Men exhibition back in 2013.
That's right.
So I think that's a really cool trend for the reception. I mean, what was it that Mark Badgett was saying yesterday? Like, I'm surprised that these Kirby pieces are not hanging in the modern. They're not hanging in the Met. They should be. And that's part of how Kirby can be understood in a new way, too. I want to put in a plug, in fact, on that score because of the expanding appreciation of comics art in the art world or museum world. Just in these last few weeks, my colleague Kim Munson has published this book called Comic Art in Museums, which takes a long history from like the 40s, I think, forward. It's an edited collection of many things, long history, many perspectives. There's some stuff about our 2015 Cal State Northridge Kirby exhibition in here. There's essays by Alexi Worth and Doug Harvey that are sort of related to the exhibition and the sort of art world reckoning with Kirby. As an aside, I have a piece in here that's not about Kirby. It's my review of the Robert Crumb Genesis exhibition that was at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, which just started out as a blog post, and I'm really glad to see it here. So there's lots of good folks represented. A really clever cover, I think, on this book.
That's pretty
very art gallery-esque. So props to Kim Munson for putting that together. That's another exciting move in that direction. I'm really excited about diversifying Kirby studies. I'm thinking, for example, of what the museum did, what you did with Ilana Levin and company for the panel that you put together for New York Comic Con last year on Kirby's women characters with Ilana and Heidi McDonald and several others. And that's a panel that people can see at least in part on YouTube. Great thing to check out. I'm also interested in projects like Black Kirby, which is the collaboration of Stacey Robinson and John Jennings. Together, they are Black Kirby, and they have done this through books and exhibitions and illustrations. And the cool thing about that is that they're not only doing homages to or appropriations of particular images by Kirby, which they sometimes have done, but they're also thinking about everything that he's kind of inspired in the culture. There's an Afro-futuristic aesthetic that they're advancing here. It's homages to Kirby. It's arguments with Kirby. It's kind of dealing with the huge impact of Kirby in the culture. And so when you have a project like Black Kirby, it really shows you how you can wrestle with Kirby in a creative way. And I think lots of creators in the art world and in comics and in film and so on are really wrestling with that themselves. So this is really a propitious moment to see that kind of thing really growing.
Yeah.
Of course, I love the collages. I continue to be fascinated by these. I mean, even some fans of Kirby comics are thrown by these. Like, what do we do with this? You know?
Yeah.
You ever heard that line that, oh, Jack was just lazy? So I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Lazy?
Yeah.
You want to draw?
Yeah, I mean, ridiculous, right? I walked through the Cal State Northridge exhibition with a fellow CSUN teacher who's an art teacher of painting. Didn't know Kirby's work much at all, although he'd seen some Marvel comics and seen the iconic characters as a kid, and was particularly fascinated by these and made this real art school observation, which is that, oh, these collages are the same visual language as the drawings, right? And this is somebody who is really looking at this stuff for the first time. I'm really loving that. It's absolutely part of Kirby's a visual language.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and they took so much work to do. And you heard Tracy Kirby yesterday, right? Talking about how she and her grandfather would hang around making collages in the house.
It's crazy.
In his copious spare time, right?
That's right.
would be doing this. Amazing to think about. This is one of the previously unpublished ones that we had in the Northridge exhibition 5 years ago. And this really throws a wrench into the way that we think about cartooning and comics art. I mean that I think in a good way. So it's fascinating that Kirby just glommed onto this technique, and how and why remains like a great undiscovered Kirby mystery, but boy, he was into it, and he did it really well.
Yeah, he did.
There are some fantastic collagists in comics. I would think about people like Jeff Grogan or Eddie Campbell. I've been fascinated by Alberto Breccia, the great Argentine comics artist whose work we see here. He did all kinds of collage work for both color and black and white comics, often really spooky work. And he was doing it in the 60s when Kirby was also starting to do it in comics. Now, Breccia was sort of like a post-Caniff realistic adventure artist when he was starting out, as a cartoonist and illustrator, maybe 1930s, 40s, working in the Argentinian market. But boy, he started using all kinds of physical material. Like he started doing like mono prints and weird stuff. I mean, from a comic art perspective, it's weird stuff. And then he really gets into these collages. I think it's kind of amazing and roughly contemporary with Kirby on the collage front. So this is something I'm researching. So I just kind of threw these images in here because I'm really interested in this right now.
And was it the Argentinian publishing market that was supporting him? Like, was he getting in Argentina? Or?
Yeah, Fantagraphics is doing this reprint series in Alberto Breccia Library. They've done, I think, a couple of volumes so far. So it's the most sustained effort at English translation of Breccia in North America that we've seen. A breakthrough work was Mort Cinder in the early 60s, which Hector Osterheld wrote. Not notable for the use of collage, but man, if you haven't seen that Mort Cinder volume, it is like an orgy of atmospheric drawing. It will just blow you away. And then he gets into, I think in Paramus and in some of his later works and his Lovecraft adaptations, which are really spooky. He really gets into this. So he by then he was sort of a grand master. So there was some support through albums or through periodicals for him doing this kind of work, really through probably publishing houses in Buenos Aires. But I don't know enough. I don't know enough yet. But there's a great comics history there.
Yeah.
And of course, we're familiar with ironic and satirical and political uses of collage in comics, often from feminist perspectives. So we have like Julie Doucet here. This is from Carpet Sweeper Tales, where she takes a bunch of sort of Better Homes and Gardens or Good Housekeeping kind of images, as well as images from Italian fumetti, and then she starts putting text to them. And this is a tradition that just keeps on going. She does these things with gender and with genre and with absurd language. This is a lot more ironic than Kirby's use of collage tends to be, but it's another little fascinating channel to explore. And lest we forget, Kirby's own work.
Lest we forget. That's right.
Yeah, was famously used in one of the first pieces of pop art to really get any kind of international rep, which is this collage from 1956. Just what is it that makes today's home so different and so appealing? This is credited to Richard Hamilton, and it has these overripe sort of woman and man images combined with banal consumer products like a Tootsie Pop or a baked ham. Now, as a Kirby fan, I feel weird about having a cover of Young Romance in the middle of all this. This is Young Romance 26, which was done about 6 years before this collage was made.
Yeah.
But, we forget what well, maybe we don't forget, but maybe we don't properly understand, or maybe I just haven't begun to properly understand until lately, what a huge impact romance comics had on pop art in general.
And there have been people who have said that the very term pop art came from that Tootsie Pop.
That seems right, and it's also conspicuously placed, the Tootsie Pop, which is just weird. Let me go no further with that right now.
That's right. We'll move on.
We're familiar with Roy Liechtenstein, who is interests some comics fans and is resented by others, and we know that Liechtenstein did so much work with the romance comics aesthetic, looking at comics by people like John Romita and George Tuska and so on. So we have that, but I think this kind of distorts our historical memory of romance comics, as a hugely popular, not ironic, not campy, hugely popular late 40s, early 50s thing. Like those estimates that the genre that Simon and Kirby kickstarted was 1/4 of the comic book market by 1950. Like, holy cow, and this wasn't camp stuff. This was stuff that was socially engaged and interesting and emotionally, riveting to lots of readers at the time.
When just my own personal anecdote was summer camp, where I had the stack of comics moving around between the boys' tents. My sisters had the same stacks of comics, of romance comics, going around their cabins at the girls' camp. This is the early 70s, the late 60s. They loved this stuff, and it was just, they just loved it. It was fun,
Yeah, I'm really excited about the prospects for more research in this area. You may remember that Harry Mendrick has pretty clearly established through his research on Simon and Kirby that for about a decade, romance kept Kirby busier than all the other genres he was working. In fact, all the other genres combined that he was working with during that span. So, and I think we, remarked yesterday, or one of you may have remarked yesterday, that, romance bought Kirby a house in Long Island, right?
That's one of my lines. Yeah.
It's a great line. It's a truth. And so thinking about, I'm really interested in the way that people were trying to do things that we now take for granted in comics, like, designed for the more adult readers. They dropped that logo pretty quickly, but it was something that they wanted to make it like it's young, but it's adult.
Yeah.
So they were staking that out, right? Or the way that even In Love, which I think was Simon and Kirby's mainline romance book in the early 50s.
Yep.
I had several covers in a row. I don't have an image of it here, unfortunately, where they would say a full-length love novel because they were doing a story longer than 8 pages or 12 pages.
Yes.
It's like graphic novel rhetoric before that has even arrived. It was mentioned yesterday that there's an early issue of Boy Commandos that's a book-length story. It's about the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. Really unusual in a 64-page comic at the time, right? Or a 48-page comic, depending on the era. So they were trying to use romance to tell some long stories, as they did in a few issues of In Love in their mainline title. So there's a lot of pushing at the boundaries of comics through, yes, crime too, genres like that, but also the romance stuff. Yeah. So I'd want to mention Michelle Nolan's book, Love on the Racks, which is a history of American romance comics, came out a few years ago. It's the first such history of its kind. I think that's a really valuable piece of work. It's also been interesting to see some romance reprint volumes with artists like Ogden Whitney or Matt Baker, kind of bringing us into that history beyond Simon and Kirby's shop.
Yeah.
And I know that this weekend you're talking to Sydney Heifler about romance comics, and this is a cover of a recent issue of Panel by Panel, where her historical essay, really tracking the rise and fall of the genre. It's sort of the backbone of this one issue, panel by panel, number 36.
Yeah.
So it's interspersed throughout a number of other articles, and so Sidney's work there kind of really forms the spine of this issue, which I think is a really cool thing. So I just want to do a shout out for like the increasing romance comics research.
Yeah.
I mean, it's totally neglected in things like Hand of Fire, right? I mean, there's a couple of drive-by references there, but honestly, we need to get more deeply into that channel for sure.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I was mentioning this yesterday at our conversation at the end of the day, Jack Kirby's draft registration card from October 16th, 1940, which Alex J. has blogged just this week. Now, Alex J. has done some other stuff too with census information and draft information, both about Jack Kirby and about his father, Ben Kurtzberg, in the World War I era. So this week he posted these images of this draft card, and as I think I mentioned yesterday, I mean, it's really interesting. Like, so for example, Kurtzberg is crossed out at the top, and it says legal change to Kirby, right?
Yeah.
But we know that when Kirby was in Georgia in training in 1943, he was Jack Kurtzberg.
That's right.
In the Army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the newspaper, right? Where they mentioned
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
I was looking up, in fact, that clipping in Mark Evanier's Kirby King of Comics last night, just trying to get my memory straight.
Yeah, sure.
As I might have mentioned yesterday, the local draft board here on Brighton 6th Street in Brooklyn is about a 10-minute walk from the Banner 3rd Road address that Kirby gives for his mother Rose here. And like probably more than 300,000 men between ages 21 and 36 in Brooklyn alone.
Wow. Just
in that borough alone, were out for draft registration between about 7 in the morning to the late evening on that one day, October 16th. Of course, Kirby himself doesn't end up in the Army for the better part of another 3 years, 2.5 years. But the reason I brought this up is because I'm really interested in what was happening to Kirby in the year or so before America's entry into the war in December of 41, and then again in the months, or let's say the year or so afterwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything just develops so insanely rapidly. And that's an intense time in the life of the nation and in the life of Kirby, obviously.
Yeah, Alex is a great researcher and has been a big supporter of our collection. He's actually donated a lot of fanzines and old comics to our archives. That's really appreciate.
Really awesome. I can tell that Alex loves to delve and has been pulling up and alerting people to some of the great resources just through census stuff and other things that we can have access to. So it's cool to hear about his support. My guess is that Boy Commandos went on the drawing board sometime in the first few weeks after Pearl Harbor. I mean, if you think about it, right, because it follows about 2 months after Newsboy Legion, and Newsboy Legion appears in a comic cover dated April of 42, which I think probably was on the stands in January of 42. So within a handful of weeks after the U.S. declaration of war. So you've got to imagine that Boy Commandos was either an idea already brewing, right, which maybe was then transformed by the American entry into the war, or it's something that just coalesced immediately afterwards. But it is that period where like Kate Smith and other pop singers have Remember Pearl Harbor songs on the hit parade within less than a month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So it's a really intense period, and I'm thinking about that. I'm really interested in the militarized twist on the sort of kid gang premise that we get here, and the kid gang stuff in general.
Well, it's interesting too that isn't there some information about how when Simon and Kirby went to National, and they kind of struggled to find something for a little bit. There was like Super Sherlock Holmes was posited, and they took over Manhunter and Sandman, so it was like, what's going to be, here we've got the big boys. We've got like, after Siegel and Schuster, we've got Simon and Kirby. What are they going to do? And they got Newsboy Legion, and they start working. I mean, it makes sense a little bit to just say, like, they did Newsboy Legion, and then the Japanese attacked, and then let's create this, right?
What I'm thinking is that, like, to me, the Kid Gang strips, the Newsboys and the Boy Commandos, are the real breakthrough here. I mean, they picked up a couple of acrobatic hero strips in a sort of Captain America vein, and they made those much more exciting with Manhunter and with the Sandman and Sandy. But those they're not holding actions, but they don't feel quite as like distinct as these things. They really hit something. And I think, just on the basis of some research I would need to corroborate, like looking through the Grand Comics database and the Kirby checklist and so on, that ironically in December of 1941, when the U.S. entered the war, Jack Kirby published very little comic book work in that month. Now, of course, anything that did come out in December would probably have been drawn months beforehand. Right? So there's that interval where they say that Simon and Kirby were given the boot from Timely while they were working on the 10th issue of Captain America Comics, which I think came out in November, but it could have been drawn in the late summer, early fall. I'm just guesstimating here. But there is a kind of lull where they are, I don't want to say they're woodshedding, but they're preparing something, right? And so, ironically, like, we think of Simon and Kirby as the creators of the great Star-Spangled Flag waving super patriot character. Well, they got the boot from that character, or the boot from Timely, even before Pearl and the American entry into the war. So there's this weird period of intense adjustment professionally as well as nationally that's going on here. The Newsboys really taps Kirby's adolescent experience in the Boys Brotherhood Republic. It really feels like a fanciful or fantastical spin on some autobiographical material. Even the idea of kids that are sort of caught between the allure of crime, they're like plucky streetwise kids, but then again, they want to do right, and they're kind of moving in a pro-social direction. They have a guardian or sponsor, literally the guardian. That matches the kind of things people were saying about the Boys Brotherhood Republic even many, many years earlier. So it feels like, Young Allies earlier than this was a step, like a kid group, but this is the one that really feels like it's tapping some of Kirby's autobiographical experience here.
And the thing too is that, like, the play Dead End, or even the some of the movies that was years earlier, I believe. So so there were already the kind of like the street tough kids were in the culture, but they weren't in the comics yet. Like in this way. So,
the play Dead End comes out in 1935, and then there's a movie version in the late 30s with Humphrey Bogart and Joel McCrea, among others. And then there's a whole bunch of these films, the sort of Angels with Dirty Faces films, or the Hell's Kitchen films. I think we have a representative image here coming up of that phenomenon, in fact.
There we go. I'm sorry.
We have it there, right? So it's funny because some of the old posters for Dead End that I look up don't emphasize the Dead End kids. But some of the other ones do, and they sort of become stars in their own right. It's also the moment when Bogart's star is kind of emerging, and it's rising. So, and then you end up with the Bowery Boys, the East Side Kids, the kind of comical kind of spins on this formula that went for film after film after film, basically B movies. But yeah, I mean, but it's a formula, right? And Kirby and Simon probably recognized that there was a successful, I mean, by the end of the 30s, it's definitely a successful Hollywood film formula. But Kirby sort of lived a version of this formula when he was an adolescent, right? He came by it honestly. I mean, we've all read those interview comments where he said, being a crook, or being a gangster was one like aspirational, sort of thing for some kids in his neighborhood. It seemed like a way out, maybe
or a crooked politician or a cop.
Yeah, that's right. And so he probably glommed onto this pretty readily. But 35 is when the play Dead End comes out, and there are several movies with the Dead End kids by 1940, 41. So that's probably in full swing.
It feels so similar to like looking at the magazine racks and realizing that there wasn't a comic for the True Confession readers. Like there's just that looking at the scope, the media, landscape, and saying, where's the comics?
One thing that really gets me, and I don't know if this has come up in your conversations yet this weekend, but You know how the fourth world sort of takes up all the oxygen in the room when we're talking about Kirby in the early 70s? But at the same time, he's pitching the same genres that were evergreen for him and Joe Simon.
Yeah.
So he's got a romance magazine that he struggles to make, that he wants to make, didn't really get to make. He's got a sort of black magic style supernatural horror or suspense magazine, Spirit World, that he's selling these. And he's got a crime book in the Days of the Mob, and he's got the Newsboy Legion in Jimmy Olsen. So he's kind of going back to all this stuff. Like, he's pushing himself to do stuff he's never done before, but at the same time, everything and the kitchen sink, right? Like you mentioned, the revived Newsboys who are like Newsboy clones or whatever. In the storyline, it feels like he's deliberately, doing a riff on his own history there. Here's an example of Boy Commandos that actually bothers me a bit because it's a really brutally sort of racist anti-Japanese story. It's one of the early ones. It's Treachery of Otsuki. And I had been writing about this for a conference paper sometime these last couple of years. And this kind of promotes the old, Japanese people by their nature are perfidious people who will stab you in the back. It's the kind of, but very much the betrayal and the untrustworthiness of, the Japanese, quote unquote, is part of American pop culture almost immediately, and certainly in 42. So I think and Kirby hasn't actually been to war yet, right? Right. These are pre-war comics by Kirby, so I've been thinking about this. It's a little discomforting to think about. It's a subject that I need to do more research on because obviously I need to know more about the depiction of Japanese people in American pop culture generally, about the imprisonment or internment of Japanese Americans in the period, and also about how war comics conventions kind of evolve, because I've noticed that later war comics by Kirby do different things with these questions. Yeah. Like this one from the mid-'70s, Bushido, his short run on the Losers. This is sort of a morally shaded, complex story in which Yamashita, the Japanese commander, is some ways more honor-driven than the Losers, and it proves to be his undoing, and he dies in a hail of machine gun fire. In the end, it's really a kind of bitter and potent thing, and I wonder about it. It too might be leaning into some stereotypes, but it's a very different portrayal of a Japanese military officer. And of course, war comics have changed by then too, so we'd have to kind of look at that. And Kirby's depiction of other character types, ethno-racial types, is different in his comics across the board too. Yeah. It's totally different. We'd have to look at his depiction of other kinds of characters. But I love the Kid Gang stuff. I'd like to do, and I'd like to see more research here, right? Because as we were saying, things are happening really, really, really fast. So, Simon and Kirby are severed from their big hit Captain America comics, maybe in mid or late mid 41. They developed these things for National or DC soon after. And it starts getting into some interesting areas about how boys are depicted. So I'm thinking about scholars like Kenneth Kidd, who studied sort of the so-called feral boy or the semi-wild boy, which is an American type. It's kind of a Tom Sawyer type. There's a history. So I'm thinking, what was Kirby tapping into? Also, there's a really interesting book by Pamela Wojcik, who's a film scholar, called Fantasies of Neglect. You can see it's Shirley Temple on the cover. What she does in this book, mostly through film, some of it through fiction, is she looks at how, impoverished kids in the city, these are stories of neglect and abuse. But also, as she points out, there's stories of like autonomy, where the kids sort of navigate the city in their own plucky, independent manner. Yes. And they have their own lives. And so she looks at Shirley Temple films. She looks at Little Orphan Annie. And then coming forward in history, things like Louise Fitzhugh's Harriet the Spy, and she looks at the dead end kids a bit in this book, and I'm thinking, well, that's a really interesting. She has this type that she's studying that she calls the self-sufficient mobile urban child, and I sort of feel like the Newsboys are like that, not the Boy Commandos or some of the other boy groups so much, but the Newsboys are really like a suicide slum. They're a tenement sort of. They're an urban kids. So this is really reminds me of Kirby's Street Code and some of his depictions of life in the city. So yeah, and of course they sort of hedged their bets by having a costume superhero in the Newsboy Legion. I'm wondering how much Daredevil and the Little Wise Guys was influenced by this stuff. That's another classic 40s franchise in comics. So I feel like kid gangs and romance and also war comics are things that are neglected in. They're certainly not touched upon very much in Hand of Fire, but there's also some opportunities, and this is kind of what excites me to get into these unexplored areas.
Yep.
And I should say this is one reason why my colleagues Craig Fisher and Ben Saunders and I are co-editing a new anthology of Kirby criticism, and that's it's going to be a multiple author thing, and that's a project that will be launching publicly soon. So it'll be titled something like The Comics of Jack Kirby, and it will be hopefully a great variety of people. And we want to sort of hang out our shingle and get the variety of different perspectives that I was just alluding to in our conversation here. Because I think, we can talk about Kirby beyond the golden 1960s span of Marvel marquee characters. We can talk about that. Understandably, the superhero is kind of the first obvious target for Kirby studies as far as scholarship. It's a big target. But there's a roughly half-century career of innovation in a variety of genres, I think on the one hand, Jack Kirby, Kirby's kind of opportunistic. Like, hey, if there's something out there, if it's True Confession pulps, or if it's the Dead End Kids, we're going to grab it, right? We're going to grab it and bring it to comics. On the other hand, he always makes it seem genuine and just dyed-in-the-wool Kirby when he does it. It's one of those great things about him that he's constantly trying to scan the world for what might be a popular trend, but at the same time, and I'm sure you both probably have your own favorite examples of this, he decides to do something and then he does it in a way that is just distinctly his. Like, well, I'll do an Exorcist story in Commandy, but it turns out to be about a psychic cat.
Yeah, right.
It's like, okay, and it turns out to be a terrifically atmospheric comic, like really cool, but it's like, okay, that's.
I still get a kick out of. Well, I don't know, it's a kick, but it's bittersweet stuff. We were talking about Spirit World and In the Days of the Mob. I mean, those were pre-Exorcist and Godfather movies, if I recall correctly, and to know that there may have been things going on in book publishing that Jack was thinking that this was something. And that it should be a magazine would be a thing to do, but imagine if In the Days of the Mob had been on the racks a month after The Godfather exploded onto the screen.
Really
thing.
Man. No, that's a good thing to point out. Actually, there's a wave of nostalgia for the Depression in the early 70s.
Yes,
isn't that weird? But there is, like in the Nixon era, there's this wave in which you have films like The Sting and Paper Moon and so on. Right. You had Arthur Penn's film Bonnie and Clyde several years before The Godfather, which is partly nostalgic, but then ends in like just an explosion of violence.
Yeah,
it ends brutally.
Yeah,
but lest we forget, like Earl Scruggs doing Foggy Mountain Breakdown on that soundtrack that made a brand new hit. Or we might remember the ragtime revival that Marvin Hamlish's score for The Sting helped to propel in the American charts. So Kirby's doing like the Fourth World stuff, which is, at least in terms of its scope, is not like anybody's quite done in the comics before. I mean, he's getting his mythological themes in, which have been an obsession since he was a kid. But at the same time, he is kind of trying to. I don't know if it's nostalgia, but there's like a recognition that maybe some adults would want to queue up for a differently formatted comics magazine. And of course, all those experiments proved to be far less than he conceived, because DC wasn't behind them.
And the significant distribution and newsstand problems. I mean, no matter what, how they may have improved the product, the stands probably wouldn't have wanted it anyhow.
No, that is probably true. But I was surprised to learn that those magazines of the early 70s may have been envisioned as slick full color magazines, because when you hear about them first, you just assume, oh, it's the Warren format. It's like the eerie, creepy format. It's that kind of thing, right? But apparently, at least according to Mark Evanier's work in that area, this is, and I think John Cook's work in that area too has been revealing. Like Kirby would have liked to have, pitched something that really would have, gotten some traction there. You remember how New Gods becomes a crime comic for a couple of issues, like Orion's Mob and the Deep Sick? Yeah. Remember this?
Yes.
These guys are like wearing Homburgs and they have double-breasted suits. Like, what is going on here?
Snaky, my friend Snaky. Yeah.
It's like Danny Fingeroth's observations, rereading his Stan Lee bio right now. And he makes some interesting observations about Spider-Man, qualities in Spider-Man that I attribute to Steve Ditko, but the fact that like the settings and the clothing and stuff in Peter Parker's world in the early 60s really seemed to belong to a previous generation, So even though Ditko's a younger artist than Kirby, he's a bit younger, he's already harking back to like his formative years when Ditko depicts like, put upon Peter Parker in high school. It doesn't necessarily look like 1963. Maybe it does, but he's got these other things. And Kirby's got this thing where the New Gods has a little taste of like headline comics or something from the late 40s or early 50s. It's just a strange thing. But never leave anything behind seems to have been the Kirby motto.
Sure.
If you can reuse romance, for example, in a superhero book, you can change the way superhero books are made, which is that's the Marvel story, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So new directions in Kirby studies, things that either I'd like to be working on or I am working on, or things that I hope that the new book that my partners and I have begun to cook up will be able to include. So I would like to see all of that continue to expand.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I see Ben and I think Craig, Ben and Craig have been commenting from YouTube. And
that's cool.
Adam McGovern. Has there been any questions that we could? I guess that's at Adam. Commandia.
Yeah. But in response to that, Adam, if we think of like Pamela Wojcik's a thesis about fantasies of neglect, and we think about the Dead End Kids or the Newsboys, the thing about Kamandi is that there's this sense in the comic that persists that he's a loner, even though in fact he has friends like Ben or Dr. Kane or whatever. There's a whole. I mean, Kirby can't help himself. He brings in a bunch of interesting characters, Prince Tufton, whatever, right? Yeah. But Kamandi's lonely a lot. He doesn't have a gang that is his, at least not consistently. And even like Ben and his fellow mutants seem somehow separated from Kamandi by dint of age or something. So it's like, I feel like, I mean, you remember the end of Kamandi #1, like, I'm not alone.
Yeah,
I'm not
right.
alone. It's like,
when he's Ben. Yeah.
It's very moving, right?
Yeah.
But he still lashes out with rage or frustration when he sees people treated as kind of pets and draft animals, even people that might be in his own age cohort, women, men who are on leashes and stuff. You remember how this explosive anger sometimes pops up in Kamandi. So Kamandi's got a different set of issues, but I would love to do a study called Kirby's Boys that might end with Kamandi. Or deal with Kamandi later, but deal with the groups first, because Jeet here makes this wonderful point that for Kirby, a lot of it's about camaraderie. I mean, we see him as working alone a lot, but he has this passion for groups. Like we know that the X-Men is a spin-off of the Kid Gang premise, right? In a way, it is. Even the Howling Commandos are kind of related to that idea that you need a repertory company of characters to kind of strike sparks. But Kamandi is a little stranded because of his post-apocalyptic setting, I guess. But to me, there's a lot of pathos in it.
Yeah.
But I think that neglect, and there's a positive side to it. As a kid, you love that peripatetic wandering. Like, I'm going to be that wild kid, the shirtless wild child.
Totally great.
Who does that thing. It's going to be like super freeing. The world has to go to hell in a handbasket before I can get there, but it'll be really cool, right? but it's so different from him, I think, channeling that kind of BBR memory that he probably had for the Kid Gang strips, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I sometimes even call the Avengers grown-up Kid Gang because of the bickering. Not as much. But.
I wonder if he associated Kamandi with growing up and how he felt like he was to a certain extent an outsider because he liked science fiction and everybody else would look down on him if he ever revealed that he read science fiction pulps and things like that.
Well, he had that reader-writer life, I think, from early on. Yeah. But the way he characterizes his life, for example, in Street Code, and that great story, makes you think that this wasn't a passion that was shared with too many of the kids,
right?
That he ran with, and so he probably was a little self-protective, maybe about that aspect of himself, but it was consuming for him. He was really into it.
He did. There were, I think, in some of Ray Wyman's pieces, there were some comments about public drawing, like drawing on the side on the street. So there may have been some drawing, but maybe not a lot of reading that was public. Like
that's right. That's a good point. I sort of envision, young Jakey, doing chalk drawings on cement or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, look at that. See?
I think that's something I've heard from more than one interview. I think with an old timer, a comics artist from that formative era. But yeah, Kirby had nerd interests.
He did
in a really brutal environment, right? He had those interests. True. So Tom, I take your point. So maybe there's that loner side of him, right? So different from the feelings of togetherness that you get, like in the page with young Franklin Richards, that you guys were showing yesterday from Fantastic Four, or even the beautiful, corny but beautiful ending of Bicentennial Battles, where Cap's with all the kids.
Yeah,
that's my favorite Cap story ever. I think it's about agonizing over what America might be.
And
then having the promise of a diverse set of kids at the end of that, and that big spread. It's a very unusual spread for Kirby, but it feels like the right ending for that story, for sure.
Right. Well, yeah. So let's see.
There's a question here.
It's from someone who's going by the Mastodon.
Yes.
Is that like a Mark Schultz drawing of a mastodon from Xenozoic Tales or something? It's a tiny little image. I can't tell. I gave Silver Star and also Captain Victory short shrift when I wrote Hand of Fire. I wish that I hadn't. Hand of Fire is wrong about several things, but I think it's a little too peremptory in its judgment of the kind of Pacific and Eclipse era of Kirby independent comics. Silver Star freaks me out. I had occasion to reread it. And I'll say in the last handful of years, maybe around the exhibition time, I think we had the great Angel of Death splash, I think, in the exhibition. And at that point in Silver Star, I hardly understand what's happening in the story because Darius Drum, the villain, is transforming into something else. But his comeuppance is brilliant. So I think
Death
it's a
Angel.
It's a really interesting comic that feels like a sort of Homo Superior's X-Men premise at first, and then it does this, I don't want to say it does this left field turn, but it's really wild. From that era, I really like the first half dozen issues of Captain Victory. I think that's kind of, like Kirby's dread of the hive mind of insects, which comes up in various places, is really done well there. Silver Star, it is a trip. I'm just thinking about the way it begins with the girl and her song. It's intense. I mean, I think, I don't know what to think of Silver Star because, Kirby's my auteur, and I think everything by him is interesting. So that's how it is, right? Like if you're a Hitchcock film fan, even the Hitchcock films that most people say are, not the beloved Hitchcock films are the ones they really interest you, right? But no, I think it was. There's a really dark turn, I think, in Kirby in that. I mean, we know that Captain Victory initially as a film treatment or concept was Kirby's anti-Close Encounters, right? His sense,
Right.
Yes.
That Kirby's Aliens, it was more like, the Puppet Masters a la Heinlein or something. It wasn't like Spielberg's When You Wish Upon a Star, right? And then Silver Star is kind of like, if an X-Men-like premise could be channeled for a good self-contained story. And I think there's some really striking pages in Silver Star that are sort of frightening.
Yeah.
And I like it that way, in the same way that Hunger Dogs, which we were mentioning yesterday, kind of bugs me. It gets under my skin. I think at that point, the easy sureties of a monthly comic book are gone,
Right.
And Kirby is just, So I like the comment that just popped up now that Silver Star represents an allegory about the perils of extremism. And in that way, it's a brilliant sort of kind of phatic work that, what was it that Tom Scioli said yesterday? He said that some of the work is really easy to tack into as a reader, let's say, especially if you come from the Kirby Marvel vintage stuff of the 60s. And then other work, maybe you have to be, I think Tom said it was, like the Hunger Dogs, you had to approach with a certain generosity in order to understand what that's all about. It's late style. Edward Said wrote about this, and what happens to the late style of a great writer or a great artist. In a sense, it's a victory lap, but it's a victory lap that's not like hollowly reassuring. It's more like, man, and I love that about Silver Star. I think that's really interesting.
Well, we've 51 minutes in, and I have got to go and get ready for the next show.
Do your thing.
And so do I.
Who's coming up next?
David Russell. He's a concept artist. Story.
Yeah.
No. Barry Geller's coming.
Barry Geller is next.
Okay.
Barry Geller.
Awesome.
So we've got to get ready for Barry.
Thank you for hosting me. It's been a delight to talk about.
Thank you for
about these things.
being a part of it.
Oh, it's really delightful. I have several videos I need to catch up on. I was able to catch a few live yesterday, and I hope to catch a few more live this weekend. But bless you all for bringing a diverse set of people to come in and chat about Kirby stuff. That's really cool.
Yeah. So thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Talk to you later. Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.